Morning, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute as people log on and get audio set up. Okay, let's get started. Good morning. My name is Leah Keating. I am the Director of Key Accounts for Parity. On behalf of HANIC, Parity, and Enpower, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know we've spoken to probably a lot of you over the past few years about Local Law 97 and the Carbon Reduction Act that's been on the horizon. And we are here, 2024. So we have some great information for you today. I'm going to ask that we save the questions and answers for the end. We'll get to them all. If you want to, please add those to that Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We would be happy to address those. And let's get started. Next slide. Okay. So today's agenda, we're going to go over Local Law 97 and some other applicable laws and how they all intertwine. We're going to get into how it specifically impacts the hotel industry, things that operators should need to look out for. James Hanna is going to bring us some information about some low-hanging fruit, reducing energy consumption through automation. And then we're going to get to the real heart of what we need to be doing right now, essential steps. Again, we'll do the question and answers. And this session is being recorded, so we will be able to distribute that afterwards as well. Next slide. Okay, so I would like to introduce James Hanna from Parity. James has spent, I think, the entirety of his career in the energy management space here in New York City. Previously with Bright Power, now as the Managing Director of U.S. Business for Parity. And then also with us today is Mike Scorrano from the Enpower Group. Mike, I think you have about 25 years experience in engineering, and he's the Managing Director and founder of Enpower Group, which is an engineering management firm here in New York City. Both speakers very, very well versed in Local Law 97 and specifically working with hotels to let you know what we need to be doing to get you into compliance. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Leah. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Hotel Association here at Group to kind of talk about Local 97. I did see that it was talked about Local 97 countdown. I thought more like, you know, the more apropos phrase of like Houston, we have liftoff, given where 97 actually started for right now. And I'm not going to say that this is, you know, one great step for man, one great leap for mankind or whatever Neil Armstrong exactly said, paraphrase, but certainly it has changed sort of the dynamic landscape of what we have to do in the city and what you guys as hotel operators have to do in the city in terms of how you guys operate your building and potential fines and penalties. Just a quick little background on myself, you know, Enpower Group's an energy efficiency company, engineering and decarbonization company, started in 2003 by myself. You know, we provide a full suite of infrastructure projects in terms of Local 97 studies, 87 studies, and just a lot of engineering projects. We certainly work with a lot of hotels in the New York City market and other places in the country, and certainly are a pretty good resource for helping you guys, you know, navigate all of your different skills and things that you guys need for Local 97 compliance. Next slide. And again, just we order a whole host of different stuff. So I know in some of the hotels we've worked on energy studies, we've worked on Local 97, we've done, you know, gas conversions, we've done building upgrades, we've done electrification. So just again, a whole suite of different measures we can assist, and certainly we can have a more in-depth conversation later. And I just appreciate the opportunity. So Local 97, you can go to the next slide. Really, you know, what is it? You know, in 2019, to step backwards, the city passed a comprehensive bill called the Climate Mobilization Act, which was a series of various different measures, one of which was Local 97. In Local 97, it had a goal of reducing carbon emissions by 80% by the year 2050 compared to 2005 baseline. And based on that premise, the city put together a whole host of different metrics and goals and things along those lines in order for buildings to comply and reduce carbon emission over time. Like I said, in January of this year, Local 97 actually came in the books, like we had talked about it from 2019 through 2023. The city actually made a couple different tweaks along the way, you know, with emission factors and various other little components of it, some of which I'll get jump when we get into the back. Especially there's something called good faith effort, which they developed over time, which is something that maybe you guys will have to be able to take advantage of it. But really for buildings over 25,000 square foot, they do mandate carbon targets for buildings to basically meet. And if you don't meet those targets, they will penalize you or fine you based upon the amount of exceedance of that carbon target threshold that you do. The good thing is right now for the first compliance period, which is 2024 through 2029, the sort of the bar is somewhat high. And again, the whole goal is to reduce it by 80% over the by 2050. And some of that also thinking is that as the city reduces carbon emissions and energy consumption, the state, New York State, will also be putting a lot of money into renewable energy, such as solar, wind, hydro, in order to provide clean energy for buildings to take advantage of, which will by default, because the electricity that's produced would be carbon free, that'll also reduce your carbon reduction as well. And again, the law also specifies other ways that you can comply, such as emissions ratings, renewable energy credits, none of which, even though we're in our first year, has been fully mandated or even put in place. So right now we are moving along the lines of, you know, like typical city fashion. We have a law, the law is enacted, and we don't have all the pieces yet to understand exactly for next year. We'll get into that later of how we're supposed to comply with all the little nuances for reporting purposes, but we'll talk about that shortly. You can go to the next slide. What I want to talk about here is that, you know, you guys being hotels, you are very, you know, generally do have a pretty high energy usage. And I don't necessarily feel that the city gives you as adequate compensation for the emission factors that you guys really need. So, you know, a lot of the hotels that we get involved with, and I'm sure James will talk about as well, you just have you know, it's, you know, in New York City, footprint or building square footage dollar cost is very expensive, right? So everybody's trying to maximize the use of their buildings, you know, and from a hotel perspective, the more occupants that you guys can have in the hotel in the same square footage means the more revenue you can produce. Well, it also means that the more energy you're going to produce and the more carbon emissions per square foot that you're going to have. And if you look at this comparison chart here, you know, you guys as a hotel operator have a certain amount of CO2, tons of CO2 emission per square foot. You know, but you are lower than, we'll say, a hospital, because obviously they're more energy intensive. You know, you're a little bit better than a parking lot. But you're certainly, in my mind, you know, they could have done you a little bit more favor on how, or a little bit more generous on how credits they gave you in terms of the amount of energy emission factors that you guys are working with, which is, it really means to us and people like myself and James is that we really need to do a really good job of trying to help find opportunities for you guys to, you know, really drive down your energy usage or switch to lower carbon forms of fuel in order to make the buildings comply a lot more. So I just think from a hotel perspective, because of where the emission factors are, it's just challenging. And the only other thing I'll point out on this slide is that, you know, under the law, we are able to kind of break out other spaces or different use types. So if you're a hotel that has a pretty large commercial kitchen or restaurant, you can see if you look over to the right of the thing, they have a little bit higher allowance. So we're actually able to, and we'll talk about that when we talk about compliance, utilize that fact in order to help you out a little bit in terms of compliance. So it's just going to be generally things of these little tricks that we work on in terms of also maybe not from just a consumption perspective, but from just a modeling perspective that we can do to help you reduce your energy consumption and your carbon emission penalty. But we'll get into that in a little bit after James's slide. I would want to talk about too that, you know, Local 97, like I said, it's one law that was that came across in 2019 under the Carbon Mobilization Act, but there are a whole series of laws that are all intertwined, and each of them do have sort of a contribution or something component to the Local Law 97. And I'll get into the specifics of these, but, you know, things like benchmarking, things like the letter grades, Local 87, which has been around since 2013, the FISC program, which is on the facade, which is a potential, while it's a compliance component that that we have safe buildings and nothing falls off, it's also an opportunity to help tighten the building up. And then there's also a component for local law 152, which I'll get into in a second, just on gas, because again, the city's big push too is not only to make buildings be more green, but also to reduce greenhouse gases or fuels that contribute to greenhouse gases such as oil and gas in order to kind of phase them out over time. But I can talk about these if you go to the next slide, James. So again, Local 97 is the big gorilla, really. That has the teeth, that has the carbon penalties associated with that. I think if you go to the next slide, James, I think we kind of get into some of the laws there. Yeah, so Local 84, which is again something that you guys can just make note of, that is where we have the letter grade. So so every year we benchmark buildings in New York City that are over 25,000 square feet. Why is that important? Because that is the mechanism that we're going to be using to kind of gather all the data to also come up with what your carbon emission penalties are going to be. So it's just very important that you're working with somebody that can obviously do that effectively, and we'll get into some of the compliance piece that's required next year. But that is sort of the key thing. So when James goes through his talk and talks about some of the years of data, it's very important that you have a fairly accurate depiction of how you guys are using data, what the benchmarking score says, how much carbon that's going to produce, and we could utilize that data as a surrogate to understand what Local 97 is going to be like for you. Next slide, James. Local 87 is a law that's been on the books, like I said, since 2009, but really 2013 was the first year. And we use, and it's still a law that's in fact today. So it's based upon the last digit of your block number, where you have to do an ASHRAE level 2 audit and also get into retro commissioning of different systems. But this particular law also helps us look at Local 97 impacts, and we do studies associated with, we try to combine Local 87 compliance with Local 97 carbon mobilization to try to give more of a holistic view of how buildings could save energy and go forward from there, and carbon reduction. We'll go forward. Local 88 is actually a very new key piece. Just want to bring it to your attention. It'll be due in 2025. So by May 1st of 2025, it also ties into 97 as well, especially when it comes to some avenues to sort of reduce the amount of emissions that you get or loopholes. But it requires you have basically updated lighting in the space to comply with current energy code. And that usually requires LED lighting to be installed in the building, or have LED lighting, and also to look at sensors to match the energy code. And if you are a larger building and you have spaces over 5,000 square foot, they just want to make sure that those tenants are sub-metered properly. So just something else to kind of keep in mind. These two, Local 43 and 52, are sort of the city's attempt to reduce and phase out high carbon fossil fuels. So as you might have known, in number 4 oil, it was supposed to be phased out in 2030. They actually pushed up that timeline to 2027. There is some talk about banning it earlier, but right now 2027 is when we're actually supposed to be off of number 4 oil entirely in the city. Number 6 oil actually happened back in 2015. And Local 152 is a way for buildings to actually have to be gas inspected, especially for not as much maybe for you guys as hotel owners, but definitely on the multifamily portfolios that we get involved with, where gas piping is somewhat used to kind of flag where it may be quote unquote unsafe, and just more of a mechanism for buildings to try to get off of gas and have to go to electrification of their of their cooking system. But it's just, again, another attempt, the way I view this stuff, first for the city to kind of, again, phase out fossil fuels and things that do produce carbon, and that does somewhat tie back to Local 97. Next slide. The FISC program, just as you guys also know, this is for exterior walls and facade, more of a safety inspection, but we take the opportunity every time we see a FISC project, especially with hotels and other buildings, to try to see what they're doing, to try to see if there's ways for us to improve the envelope of the building. So if they're doing pointing or sealing, caulking around windows and things along those lines, that could actually be a very good place for buildings to kind of pick up some reduction of energy and also help on their carbon emission piece. And then the last law I just want to touch upon, just so you guys know, is Local 9294, which is, again, if you happen to have to do a renovation of your rooftop, which involves structural replacements, i.e. tilling, not just the roof itself, but the roof and the concrete member below that, you would have to be required to do either a green roof or some type of PV system that ties into that. But without further ado, I wanted to kind of pass it over to James, who's going to talk about how all his system works and how, again, as a component of Local 97 compliance, we need to have some type of glue that holds it all together. So go ahead, James, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike, and thanks for giving all that background on all these different laws. Yeah, to introduce myself, my name's James Hanna. I run the U.S. business for a company called Parity. We're an HVAC optimization as a service company, so you can really think about what we do as maximizing the performance of your existing systems. And I think the biggest thing that I hope you'll take away from what I'm going to talk about is that yes, there's a lot of local laws. Yes, there's a lot of pressure from a policy and sort of punitive point of view to reduce the amount of energy that your hotels are consuming. But there's also a really big opportunity there. I think that's sometimes what gets lost in all of this is that implementing the types of things that Mike is talking about, that I'm going to talk about a little bit, tends to have a really strong return on investment. And I think more importantly, when you're thinking about a hotel, can really help to streamline the way that the buildings operate, can help create a better guest experience, can help with ESG goals, for some of the larger corporate groups that might have those in place. So really want to get into what that looks like from a dollars and cents point of view and kind of where the rubber hits the road, so you can see some opportunities that you potentially have. A little bit more about us. We're focused on high-rise, mid-rise hotels and apartment buildings. So really focused on working with buildings with central systems, chillers, cooling towers, heating plants, ventilation. And what we do is we sit on top of the controls that exist for those systems, whether it's a building management system or system level controls, to remotely optimize the way all that equipment operates, so you're not wasting energy. We also can work with you to generate revenue through helping those systems interact with the grid in increasingly smarter and more useful ways. So to talk a little bit about Local Law 97 as it pertains to hotels, in New York City in particular, a lot of the hotels tend to be a bit more sophisticated, right? You're dealing with central cooling sometimes, certainly central heating. Oftentimes you have somewhat sophisticated ventilation systems. You're dealing with lots of different types of spaces within a hotel. You might have, of course, the guest rooms. Then you have amenity spaces. You might have a restaurant. You might have convention or business centers. So there's a lot going on within these spaces, and oftentimes that means that you have sophisticated controls, sophisticated ways that you're trying to serve all those different parts of the hotel. And they're 24/7 operations, right? You don't have the luxury of doing what you do in a office building where you get to set everything back at the end of the day or over the weekend, where it's really clear when you can do that. In a hotel, it's sort of less clear oftentimes where there's an opportunity to reduce consumption because demand maybe has even briefly dropped. So that's something that's unique, while also keeping in mind that the most important thing with a hotel, when you're thinking about HVAC in particular, energy efficiency in particular, is the guest experience and comfort, right? So you don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize the thermal comfort of a guest, particularly in a place like New York, where people are expecting a really top-notch experience. So I think that's also a critical thing to understand. And I think over the years, energy efficiency has gotten this kind of misconception about it, that energy efficiency means being colder in the summer, hotter in the summer, colder in the winter, being less comfortable. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is reducing the waste within these buildings, that the consumption you don't need to consume to still deliver the same, if not a better, thermal experience for the guests. And then, as Mike talked about, tend to be high consumers of energy. So a number of the hotels that we've looked at, in partnership with Mike and his firm, are looking at pretty substantial fines as a result of that. So that also means, just to kind of look at it glass half full, that there can be some big opportunities for optimization and strong return on investment reductions in utility costs and other benefits. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and maybe some ways to think about doing that, even if you have fairly limited staff on site to help implement some of this. So to get back to what Mike was talking about, with local law 84 and with the benchmark and really understanding where a hotel sits with local law 97, it starts with the data. So, what hotels over 25,000 square feet will do, as Mike talked about, is every year you need to submit your utility data through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager benchmarking tool to the city. So as part of that, you submit your electric, gas, steam, whatever it might be, and then you also list the size of the hotel. And if it's a mixed use building where maybe you have ground floor retail or some other stuff going on in the building, you break out all the different space types. And the way that local law 97 works is it looks at the amount of consumption that you have versus the square footage for all those different space types, per that slide that Mike showed earlier. So what we're looking at here is a hotel in Manhattan, and this, I believe, was 2021 calendar year local law 84 data, where for the 24 to 29 period of time, when the emissions are at a certain level, this hotel appeared to be in really good shape, because as we all know, during the pandemic, occupancy levels were quite a bit lower than certainly they were now or before the pandemic. But if you relied on that data, really from 2020 through 2022 is kind of the impact with 2022, really maybe just the first part of the year, there being some impact there. But if you use that data to try to get a sense for where you are in terms of your consumption, your exposure to local law 97, you might, be artificially kind of seeing a rosier picture than what might be the case, right? Because, fortunately, there's been this huge rebound in occupancy within New York City hotels. As from what we've heard and seen, hotels are back to really high occupancy, having banner years. So what we're now seeing is with this more kind of typical or even above average occupancy levels, energy consumption is going to increase with that, right? Because you have more people in the hotels. For hotels where you're able to do, in-room setbacks and all that sort of stuff when they're unoccupied, you're not able to do that quite as much, when you have more folks in the hotel. So that's a good thing. But with how local law 97 looks at that, there's more energy consumption per square foot. So this same hotel is actually looking at some exposure in 2024 to 2029. So in some ways, it's a good problem to have because it means that business is doing well, but it also means that we really want to look at opportunities to reduce consumption to really attack, in this case, that roughly 49,000 that this particular hotel is looking at through 2029. So the way we look at it at Parity, and again, we're really focused on HVAC systems and how do we optimize those systems for performance. We're really focused on the types of systems that we think can move the needle the most. We're typically talking about these central systems that, and I'll just scroll down here for a sec. Yeah, these central systems that tend to have the biggest opportunity. So your pumps, your fans, your motors, the central plant, makeup air units, air handling units, there tends to be a big opportunity. Really buildings where you're talking about steam PTAC, hot water PTAC, water source heat pump, fan coil buildings. It's a lot of what we see in New York in terms of the way that hotels are set up mechanically. There's a lot of opportunity. When you get down to the system level, you look at a individual motor on a pump or a fan. We have examples where we've saved 80% without there being any impact on guest comfort or resident comfort, depending on the type of building, by doing that. So that's really where we think there's a lot of opportunity. So to go back into that, HVAC is where a lot of the energy consumption comes from within these big hotels, right? It's over 50% typically. And they're without needing to do a big retrofit, there tends to be an ability to, get somewhere between, maybe 5 to 20%, right? So if you think about the different pathways you can take to implement energy efficiency, the first step should always be working with someone like Mike to understand where the building is, what the baseline consumption is, then understand what your options are, right? So really taking a look at your existing systems. Mike's going to talk a bit about some incentive programs that help, you take a look at those systems and sort of figure out what the condition is. But I think the big, initial decision is, do you want to implement a big retrofit of the property, right? Or is that central mechanical equipment towards the end of its useful life? Is there a good business case to, rip and replace a lot of those big central systems? Or maybe, the property is being repositioned or recapitalized and you want to, do that upgrade as part of that. Then you have an opportunity to do a much bigger, what we would call a deep retrofit, to potentially electrify some of those systems, to replace those underlying mechanical systems with more efficient systems. And then the other pathway, and this is really where we exist at Parity, is to focus on maximizing the performance of those existing systems. So typically there, you're looking at, 1 year, even like 6-month return on investments, up to 3 or 4 year return on investments in order to do that, versus sometimes longer payback to make those bigger investments. So I think that's a key thing to understand here, is that there's lots of opportunity to reduce consumption just by optimizing what you already have in the building today, without necessarily as a first step having to do these big multi-million-dollar projects. At some point, those will need to be implemented, but that's not always the best first step to take. So to get into what that could look like, and this is sort of the way that we do it at Parity, is you can integrate with existing controls these days. So you have this revolution that's really occurred in the HVAC space, where you have a lot of open communication protocols that exist. Without getting too deep into the weeds, it allows third parties like Parity to come in and integrate with those systems without you having to replace them, right? So if you already have a building management system in the building, that's great. A company like Parity can come in, sit on top of it, collect all that data, and then begin to optimize and really automate the way that the set points and the operating schedules are being operated. We've developed some software that allows us to ingest all that data, along with weather data, lots of other information about what's going on in the building, to do that in an automated fashion. And we typically will work very closely with the hotel engineers and the staff to slowly, implement the automation in a way that's going to be useful from an operations point of view, not just from an energy efficiency point of view. And that's a process that you can kind of hone and kind of help to push over time as you get more and more in tune with what's going on in the building. Typically, you can push the savings, to a higher level over time. So this is the type of thing that might yield you somewhere between 5 and maybe on the high end 20% in savings, where then the deep retrofits that you might be able to do can get you well over 40, 50 plus, even more than that percent, as you start talking about doing the bigger projects. So there's a number of different pathways you can take here. And then this I thought would be a useful thing to talk about today, given how hot it is. But the other thing that you can do with these systems, and this sort of falls outside of Local Law 97 a bit, but very much related to energy consumption, is generate revenue. So on very hot days like we have today, like we had yesterday, Con Edison will look to the market to reduce the amount of electricity that they're consuming, to prevent stress on the grid, right? To prevent the potential for brownouts, blackouts, whatever there might be. So as a hotel, if you're able to reduce motor speeds, typically is what we're talking about, maybe do some slight setbacks, do some pre-cooling, so that you're not needing to run systems as close to full speed during these peak demand windows. These demand response windows typically last for 2 to 4 hours. You can generate a lot of revenue. So something that you can do is automate the way that your mechanical systems interact with the grid in order to reduce consumption. And we found, and this is what this chart is showing, that you can really, boost the amount of revenue that you're able to generate by doing this in an automated fashion. For any hotel engineers that are on the call that have any experience with demand response, it can lead to a lot of manual kind of running around the building. making manual adjustments, which on a very hot day, you really don't want to be doing. So through automation, you can triple, sometimes more, the amount of revenue that you're generating and do it in a way that's really measured. You can be sort of sitting there at your computer, and if you feel like you need to ramp things back up so we don't lose the sort of thermal situation in the building, we have the ability to do that through automation. So this is a really exciting opportunity, not just to reduce utility costs, right? Not just to reduce exposure to local law 97, but to generate some revenue. And you can do it in ways that don't really have any impact at all on guest comfort. So some examples of what this can look like. So, this is an example of a PTAC building. So this is a hot water PTAC building here in Manhattan, where by implementing this type of solution, they generated roughly $150,000 in savings in the first year. So that's by optimizing the run times of the boilers, the hot water pumps that are circulating that hot water up to the terminal units, up to the PTACs across the building. And then we're also able to generate around $16,000 in revenue. So that works out to about an 8-month payback. So again, this is sort of low-hanging fruit, quick return on investment things that you can do to start making a dent. And then you have buildings. This would be on the very much more kind of high-end side of things. So skyscraper, also in Midtown with a more sophisticated mechanical system. So water source heat pump for part of the building, fan coil for the other part of the building, where there's even more savings potential and a lot more demand response potential here too, because there's a lot of ventilation, a lot of electricity going into motors for fans that you're able to dial back a little bit during the demand response events, and you can generate big amounts of revenue, again, without there being any comfort issues. I think there's some members of the Yankees, some very some folks that have very low tolerance for not being comfortable in their, in this case, condos, that you're able to do this sort of optimization without having an impact on that. So again, this is another less than year payback with a big return on investment. And there's ways you could do this without having to put any money in up front. I know the interest rates are higher right now. Sometimes budgets are more constrained. So this type of thing can be implemented without any upfront cost. So, what you're looking at here is this is a building where generating roughly $60,000 a year in savings, which goes up over time as utility rates go up. And obviously we've seen tremendous inflation in utility rates over the past 3 or 4 years in New York City. So a kilowatt hour or a therm of natural gas saved today is going to be much different than what it might look like in 3 or 4 years as rates continue to go up, and the value of those savings will increase. Demand response revenue, so around $9,000 in this case, and then you have the avoided local law 97 fines that kick in. So, if you were to amortize the cost of implementing some of the hardware, doing some of the setup that's needed in order to get set up in a building to do this, you're still going to see a net operating savings to the building without putting any money in up front. So it's sort of like a free found project you can do here to take a big step forward without having to make any investment, without having to tap into your CapEx budget in any way. So again, just really want to drive that point home that this doesn't need to be a big multi-million-dollar undertaking like sometimes I think the news around local law 97 has led you to believe, for certain buildings at least. So I'll hand it back to Mike to talk through some more of the details.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think that's a good point that James is making. A lot of it can just be low-hanging fruit and things that you can do, or using the existing building infrastructure to put sort of a low-cost product on things that's going to have big returns. And certainly we're big fans of the Parity system and how it complements all the work that we do in buildings and looking at larger mechanical upgrades as well. What I want to step back to, I know the Local 97 is obviously started in 2024, and really, 2025 is when we're going to have to report for the first time. So I know there's a lot of confusion or questions out there, like, what do I need to do to comply? What's going to be the requirements? I know a lot of hotels, and we've done a lot of studies looking at, I'll call it CMA's Carbon Mobilization Act reviews or roadmaps that we put together, which is part of it. But really, when you put it down as what's going to be required next year in 2025 when we go submit. And part of it is that the city has not really come out with the full requirements of what we need to do in order to say that the building's in compliance or out of compliance for 97. But what we do know is as follows, right? So in starting this year, all the energy that's being used right now is being tracked. Right. And just like you would do your local 84, 133 benchmarking, that same data would be used to go into the carbon calculation. For next year, the actual energy will have to be vetted by a licensed design professional. That's in the law. So you need to be working with somebody who can actually sign off on it. You know, I know a lot of folks still try to do their benchmarking. That's not going to be allowed unless somebody is a licensed design professional or has the other requirements that they're asking for in order to basically certify that the carbon emissions is done properly. And then we'll get into another slide of things that you can do to help that just from a benchmarking or modeling perspective. Stay back, almost done with that. Sorry. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all your data, we're going to submit it, and then basically this DOB will submit penalties based upon your exceedance of the local 97. And we would suspect that if we file in May, we'll say by May 1st, just like the benchmarking does, we would think by sometime in the October timeframe, unless there's delays, that's when the city would actually come up with some type of assessment of what the penalties would be. Now you can go on, James. So what can we do for Local 97? Obviously, like James talked about, working with a company like myself, Enpower Group, and Parity is sort of one thing to do. But really, as a first starting point, is to really know where you guys stand, right? So it'd be looking at and reviewing your 2023 benchmarking data. As James was trying to point before, that, you know, if you try to take, you know, 2019 would possibly be a good year as well if you have that data going back that far. And your occupancy is back where you are now, but also the 2023 would be more reflective of where we think you guys should be going into 2024 and beyond. So really looking at the benchmarking data that you have, and also looking at how the building is benchmarked. We do a lot of building area square foot measurements in our shop here. What does that mean? That means we go out to the building, we actually measure it. Why do we do that? Because the way the calculations are worked, it's based on it's the amount of carbon per square foot. And we know that the Department of Finance has their own rules for evaluating square footage, right? That goes into the taxes, but the local 97 actually has a different definition of actual square footage. And if we're able to come up with a calculation supported by an engineer like me that says, hey, the building is bigger than the DOF says, it's actually, you know, maybe it's 10% bigger, whatever it is, that actually is a way for us to reduce carbon emission penalties by just the fact of us doing a very small study and making sure that we include all the mechanical spaces and all that goes into the local 97. So that's one thing. Engage a qualified partner to help you execute your journey, right? So working with a company like Enpower Group or Parity is a good thing. You know, certainly if you work through Parity, they can get us involved, vice versa. And certainly that is a key thing. Why? Because we can identify not only very expensive capital measures, but we can also identify things that are sort of low cost measures and things that could go into James's platform to help you guys optimize on how you do. So when we say that we do these capital studies, then we look at various things that we can do to optimize. If you've already had a roadmap done or some other company did it, we don't need to recreate the wheel. We don't want to be duplicating work. We don't want to be charging people money for things you don't need. We could always obviously look at opportunities to, you know, review what they've done before and sort of like peer review it to see what measures that we pick out of it. There's also a good programs out there for Local 97 compliance through the various Flex Tech or NYSERDA programs. So NYSERDA has one called Flex Tech, which we're a Flex Tech partner that pays up to 50% of us doing a study in a building to identify carbon measures. We can tie in the stuff that Parity would do as well to kind of, at least from a development perspective, reduce the cost of that, which would obviously reduce James's cost maybe over time. And there's also another component now for anything to do with heat recovery. That's another good project where we can look at, you know, especially for centrally cooled buildings, we could utilize waste heat and for electrification and trying to come up with some sort of capital plans that could basically allow us to reduce carbon emissions from an investment perspective, but NYSERDA will help pay for half the cost of that. once you have your benchmark, where you stand, you've done some studies for it, then it's really sitting down and understanding, what are your capital constraints in the building? What could you do? James showed you some very good examples of how, his system actually is very cost effective. Anything in my mind that's a 2-year payback, is like golden, right? You're never going to make that, no investor is going to make that much money unless he happens to just pick the right stock at the right time. That to me, that's a real good rate of return. If you can get 2-year or less simple payback, that's probably an IRR of, well over 20% plus. So that's really, really good to try to kind of do that. And then deciding what capital needs you want to do. Financing, like James says, interest rates are up, but there are programs that do that. Execute, work with somebody like, us to help, do design drawings, bring in qualified contractors, work with your contractor network that you already have, but, obviously with a good plan. And then, once you've got all the stuff is installed, it's always looking backwards at how you're doing over time. So that's a combination of using the benchmarking data for every subsequent year going forward, and also having a system like James is in place to basically pull the BMS data and be able to kind of document how things are moving, and to make sure that you're, doing the changes, adjustments, and operating schemes to make sure that you're reducing carbon and energy as much as possible. Go ahead. Next step slide, James. And I just wanted to kind of almost finish with this. So there, for buildings that currently have a penalty, and there are a bunch of buildings that do, I mean, the way the law was originally written was that around 20 to 30% of buildings would have been, would not have been in compliance for the first period. They did put in some stuff in the language and law for basically good faith efforts. So if you happen to be a hotel that is facing a penalty right now in 2024, not the fear, it's not the end of the world yet. There are things that could be done, and the law does allow for what they call good faith effort. So we could basically defer the penalty in 2024 all the way to 2026, as long as we can put together a plan in order to have the building comply with the 2024 limits by 2026, and also that we meet the 2030 limits in 2030. So, there's a way to do that by submitting the annual benchmark emission report. We have to comply with Local 84, the 88, which I talked about before, which is the lighting law. We have to obviously make sure that, your lighting's current and does like that. And then what we would do is we would do then a decarbonization plan to, show that we are addressing measures. And if it's something that has electrification in it or some component, we can demonstrate some work. But the point is that there is a way for us to, by looking at, various different measures, putting together a decarbonization plan, working with like James's company, see what they can do to help drive down that. As long as we can demonstrate that we can hit 2024 compliance by 2026, and we put this plan in place by May 1st of next year, we can actually avoid the penalties if currently you're assessing them right now. So it's just something for buildings to kind of understand. So if you are facing a penalty right now, or you are estimated to face a penalty, you certainly should reach out to myself or James and see if you'd be a good candidate for a best face effort, decarbonization plan, and also submission, and then what measures we could pull out of that to kind of avoid. Because the last thing I want to see is buildings spend good money where they could be putting that to capital and spending it over to the city's pocket for not being in compliance with Local 97.
Yeah, and I'll just put a plug in for this too, that this is really something that people should act quickly on, and again, Mike's firm is really expert in navigating this process, but May 1st of next year is really not that far away to get to that step, right? Because there's a lot of planning that needs to happen. There's some engineering work that needs to happen to understand what the options are. So this is really a good potential pathway for a lot of hotels to consider, but you want to get on it now so that you're not sort of scrambling to put something together next spring that maybe isn't going to get you where you want to be.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you, James. Next slide. And just to leave off with, I talked about some of the incentives that are out there, but there are incentives to help pay for a lot of this stuff, right? There's state utility cash incentive programs to pay for things like studies. So a nice sort of flex tech program, like I talked about, has 50% cost reimbursement for doing the Local 97 study or 87 study that we tie into that. It could also be used to help tee up some of the costs for us to kind of go through the building and understand what's parity ready and what other incentives or what type of other hardware we may have to obviously do to the building to make that happen. If you do decide to do anything with clean heat, i.e. electrification, there are incentives to pay for that, either through heat recovery studies or actual for the equipment itself. And I know like we've been a big fan of doing, you know, some domestic hot water systems off of, especially with centrally cooled buildings, where we're grabbing the waste heat off of the condenser water and using that to drive some heat pumps. You know, we're not as big of a fan of trying to electrify buildings for heating if they're not already buildings for heating, just because of the cost and expense and the operating thing long time, and it's just not a very good return on investment. And we feel like there's other things that buildings can do, at least now in the shorter run, to make sure that's worthwhile. There's money for solar, there's money for EV chargers. Like James talked about before, there's money for demand response, which I didn't put on this list here, but where you can actually enroll and shed load during the small hours during the high summer periods of time, which generates additional revenue, which you can obviously use to reinvest in either energy efficiency upgrades or other programs to do that. Moving to financing, there is a program through NYSE, through the PACE program, so it's Property Assessed Clean Energy. It is a way, depending on the mortgage structure of the building and ownership, to, you know, utilize a loan, have that underwritten through your tax, right on your tax bill, rather than having it be a separate line item as a lease. So it's just treated a little differently. And obviously, because there's, you know, tax implication, it certainly has a little bit better favorable rates. You know, we do get involved with buildings that are doing, you know, credit lines, leasing, things like that, traditional sort of lease programs for stuff. Again, it's all going to depend on the ownership structure and how you guys are financing things. And then we have seen some third-party PPAs where, you know, we would, you know, some company would come in, and we've done a few of these ourselves on lighting, where we come in, we make the investment, we get paid back over time. You know, we're happy doing that. It's fine if it sort of makes the project go. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is that there is, under the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, IRA of 2022, there is a bunch of money that is out there in the stream to help things for things that are renewable. So anything that's geothermal, electrification, solar, there are tax credits associated with that. So depending on who the ownership structure of the building is, if they could use the tax credits, that certainly could be something that could help drive the incentive on there. You know, definitely geothermal and, you know, fuel cells is a component for it. And, you know, carbon capture has, you know, it's just something that we are looking at a bunch of buildings, depending on how they burn gas going forward and what their emissions requirements are, that we, you know, can put on the back of building of boiler systems. There's no direct correlation right now with Local 97, but there is a different revenue stream that we can go for. So it's something that we can kind of get more involved with if anybody has an interest in that sort of piece as well. So again, just a lot of, my point on this slide is there's a lot of incentives that are available, and certainly, you know, we're well versed to help, you know, take credit for those and help buildings get that incentives in order to help move the needle on Local 97 carbon reduction. Next slide. So this is you, James. So finish it off for us.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, appreciate everyone, you know, again, take the time to join and learn about this. You know, hopefully you found some useful information here. But again, I think the key takeaway here is there's a lot of support out there to help you navigate Local Law 97, which is just more generally navigating your energy management planning, navigating the way you're going to decarbonize the way that the building operates. So, you know, a lot of good resources that we shared today. We'll share this presentation and a recording of this so that people have it. But I think without taking up any other time, we'll open it up to some questions.
Okay, I have a few questions here. Start with, how are Local Law 97 fines enforced?
I'll take a stab at that one. So the truth is, we're not 100% sure exactly how they're going to do that. We definitely foresee that, you know, we're going to submit data for next year by May 1st. We're going to sign off as an example. If you're a building that does have a calculated energy penalty or a carbon penalty, that will go to the city of New York. We assume that by sometime in October, they would probably send out almost like a tax bill, send out an enforcement letter that says you owe X dollars. You know, there are some pretty significant fines for, you know, failure to report and things along those lines, but that's what we assume is going to happen. They are right now in the process of finalizing those plans. So we expect to hear by the end of the year, what the exact, mechanism for us to actually even file and then what their enforcement will be. But that's what we foresee, given other programs that we're involved with, what they would follow with.
Okay. Next question, will DOF square footage change if you measure the building at 10% larger?
I'll answer that. The answer is no. So the DOF and the DOB recognize that the two programs are not simultaneously the same, right? So the Department of Finance, when they do their tax assessment square footage, they allow you to do, they require or allow you to do carve outs for excluding mechanical spaces. Why? Because you're trying to make the building as small as possible for tax purposes. So when they do those calculations, we would basically go, when we do those as well, we go and we measure all the area of the building, then we take things that are non-revenue rent producing locations such as like boiler rooms, mechanic rooms, and we exclude those square footages. 97 came along and said, hey guys, you can take the full water wall building, the whole area, and by the way, you can take every space internally to the building and count that for your area, because obviously all that stuff has to be heated and cooled. So the DOF and the DOB recognize there's going to be disparity. When we do get to like more than 15% difference, they may ask us, or we have had this happen to us, they come back to us, they ask us to explain the difference. And generally what we do is we show our drawings, we show how those spaces all interlink and relate, and they're good with that. So the point is that there is a difference in between DOF and DOB. And from a DOB Local 97 perspective, we want to see the largest square footage we can, because the way the calculations work, it's carbon penalty per square foot. So if we can make the square footage bigger, that will help us drive down that'll give us more allowance of carbon in the building, and that will allow us to kind of comply. So when we've done these projects, we've seen ourselves, somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 do a study for square footage, and we easily seeing that's like a 1 year simple payback a lot of times, or even shorter, because we immediately find a discrepancy in a lot of that stuff, and we rectify it with the benchmarking provider, and then we use that square footage going forward from now until the end of time as far as the DOB requirements go.
Interesting. That sounds like low-hanging fruit.
That is like the lowest hanging fruit that we found. Yes.
Okay, two more questions. This one's probably for James. What options does a building with no BMS or controls have?
Yes, I mean, depending on the way that the building is set up mechanically, if you don't have a BMS or even system level controls, it probably means there's a lot of opportunity for optimization. It probably means that you're running your systems a lot more than you need to, a lot faster than you need to. So there's a lot of opportunity to take a big chunk out when it comes to energy savings. The way that we work is we meet the building where it is. So oftentimes we'll come into buildings that need to have some control hardware put in place, that need to have some automation equipment put in place. So yeah, it sounds like potentially a really good opportunity to be up closer to that 20, maybe 25% savings you can get just by optimizing the existing systems with better controls.
And last question, how much should I budget for a local law 97 filing report?
We're still looking at the pricing. So I don't know, somewhere around $1,500 is probably going to be sort of the order of magnitude that we're in right now in terms of us reviewing the data and basically signing off. There may be a setup fee just for us to review it for the first time, but that's kind of where we think the pricing is going to come out in the marketplace for doing that work.
Terrific. All right, I think that's all we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to James and Mike and to Hanek for hosting. I think this was
sorry, Leah, there's one more that came in through the Zoom.
Oh.
That I got here. So this was, how do you stand on electric boilers? Are they more cost effective than gas? So I've got some thoughts on that, but Mike, more your wheelhouse than mine. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, again, if you're just talking about electric boilers to make, steam, just like a coil, I mean, the electric, it's going to cost a lot more money, right? So if you look at the price of electric boiler compared to the price of making on gas, it's probably 3 times more costly to use electricity to drive a boiler, or like a traditional boiler, than it would for make it with gas. And we do look at heat pumps, and even on the heat pump side, which do have a coefficient of performance that's like 3 times better than a gas-fired boiler. given the price of electricity, it's still hard to make the economics work. So we're still fans of, from a cost perspective, with, gas fired boilers. And even if you take a lot of time into account the penalty associated with the gas, it's never going to overshadow the cost of the extra cost of operating the electric fired boiler. So again, having said that, we've probably done a few where it made sense, like ventilation, we had no choice, but given our druthers, electric boiler is going to be more costly to operate than a gas fired system.
Yeah, especially in a place like New York City, where electricity is so expensive here, and gas is relatively cheap. But the other thing I'll say too, and I know that Mike has done a few projects like this, and something that we're proponents of at Parity are hybrid systems. You don't need to completely convert over to electric in one fell swoop. It's very expensive to do that, and you've got to install a lot of typically heat pump capacity to deal with your design days, right? So in this case, your very, very cold days. But if you do a hybrid system where maybe you're just electrifying your domestic hot water, maybe a little bit of the space heating load, that will get you a long way for local law 97, with being a fraction of the price. And it allows you to kind of go back and forth between gas and electric. So I think that type of middle ground approach is what we're going to see more and more of as we get closer to 2030.
Yeah, because the electrification does require, if you're trying to cover the coldest day of the year, it's going to cover a lot of extra capacity for electricity, which requires a lot of update. And where we could basically leave the systems in place, I mean, the gas system, and like James said, do a hybrid approach, like you said, either domestic hot water or some smaller amount just to utilize the capacity that we have available. We could take off, maybe we could convert, 20-30% of the annual fossil fuel over to electricity, which, again, depending on where you are on your carbon penalty, may give you more than enough that you need, right? It's really, in my mind, not an all or nothing. So at least from here until 2050, we certainly see that sort of a good approach, and that's certainly a far enough horizon that we'll see what new technology arrives at that point. But I think that we've been certainly focused ourselves definitely on doing partial electrification, especially on domestic hot water or summer domestic hot water systems, where it definitely makes a lot of sense.
All right. I think we're good to go. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, James. Thank you, Hannah. I will be sending out a follow-up email, and I'll provide the link to this recording.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.